This edition of MacVoices is supported by Zapier. Connect your apps and automate your workflows. Zapier is the easiest way to automate your work. For a 14-day free trial before the end of this month, visit zapier.com/MacVoices. Welcome back to MacVoices. This is the talk of the Apple community, and I'm Chuck Joyner. Folks, we're going to talk about something that is not specifically Apple today, but I think a lot of you are interested in it, and it will cross over into the Apple sphere eventually. Mr. Kirk McElhearn is here. Kirk, welcome. It's good to see you.
Hey, Chuck. Thanks for having me back again.
Hey, it's always a pleasure. And I thought of you as soon as this story came out, and I thought we got to get together. And I'm kind of glad it's percolated just a little bit, because that gives us a little more to talk about. Frankly, it's given me a little more time to digest it. And that is the whole issue of Sonos making some of their speakers obsolete, or at least saying they weren't going to do updates, then kind of backing off on that position, and there seemed to be still a bit of uncertainty around it. So I'm going to turn you loose first. What's your thinking on this?
Well, Sonos came out, I think it was on the 20th of January, and they announced that this was a very strange announcement, because in one paragraph they said that 92% of the devices that they've sold in the last 15 years, and they started selling their first devices, I think, in 2015, 92% of them were still in use. That's an extraordinary amount of hardware that's not obsolete over that time. Obviously, you'd assume that they've had growth, regular growth over the years. So they're selling 10 units now for 15 years ago, but still 92%. And then a little bit later, they say, okay, because of reasons, we're going to make obsolete all of these devices that are older than, and there's no firm cutoff point. In fact, there are some devices that were actually still sold a few months ago that are being made obsolete, what Sonos calls obsolete, which I'll explain in a minute. Some of them have been sold for 10 years. Sonos never made a lot of devices. I think they currently only have 8 products in their catalog now. So it's never been a company with tons of different devices. But essentially what they said is that if your device is old enough for us to call it obsolete, you won't be able to use it with your current devices. Now, a lot of people were trying to figure out what this meant. And initially they said, you won't be able to update the software on the older devices. And if you want to keep using all your devices and still use the old ones, you won't be able to update the new ones. Now, the reaction in the Sonos community, which is quite a hardcore community of people who've been invested in this hardware for years, everyone was just livid. People were screaming. Then they came out and said, well, actually, we're going to try and figure out a way that you can use both of them. And it's really not even clear today what's going to happen. This change is going to be made in May. It seems to me that they should have predicted what was going to happen. That, I saw someone on Twitter who said, oh, great, I just hardwired my home 5 years ago with all this stuff. It cost thousands of dollars, and now it's all going to be obsolete. And they just didn't seem to be, I don't know, this is like a PR nightmare. This is like, it should be a case study, the worst example of PR. You certainly heard the episode of my podcast, The Next Track, last week, where we talked about this with Andy Doe. And Andy said to me, he knows that Sonos users are evangelists generally, but he's heard more in the past week since this had happened about how bad Sonos is than he'd heard in 10 years about how good Sonos is. And it's really quite stunning when you think about the reaction of these people, many of whom had been committed to Sonos for 10 or 15 years, all of a sudden felt betrayed. So there's a lot of nuance here. The first thing is, do you have any Sonos devices?
Yeah, I've standardized on Sonos a while back. So I've got several Play 5s. I've got a couple Play 1s. I've got the soundbar. I've got the sub. So this one hit me kind of hard,
so you've got a bunch of obsolete devices. And from what you just said there, you're talking about $2,000-ish in investment. So maybe a quick overview of how Sonos works. And Sonos is actually an interesting company. Until 2 weeks ago, I was very bullish on Sonos. And you've heard me on The Next Track talk about my Sonos amp and other devices. My opinion has greatly changed, because what they've done is they've taken a technical weakness in their products, and the solution that they've chosen to fix it is the worst possible. So initially, when Sonos came out, Home Wi-Fi wasn't very good. It was slow. It wasn't that reliable. So they built their own mesh network protocol. It's proprietary networking technology that they call Sonos Net. If you remember in the early days, you had to have, was it a Sonos Connect or a Sonos Bridge? You had to have a Sonos Bridge, relatively inexpensive. And what that did was that sent the Wi-Fi to the Sonos devices. Again, back then we needed it. We were at 802.11g, which wasn't very quick. Even though music doesn't send a lot of data, the way Sonos works is it's sending and receiving to all the devices at the same time. And if your network bandwidth was being used, you wouldn't get music through your speakers. And the main selling point of Sonos was that you could synchronize music playback in multiple rooms, as you're well aware. Go ahead a few years, and Sonos decided, okay, we don't need to do this anymore. We're going to just piggyback on normal Wi-Fi. Yet we're still creating our own private mesh network. So while everything's connecting to Wi-Fi, it's connecting to other Sonos devices to get the data from them rather than getting it directly over Wi-Fi. And this is important. I'll explain why in a minute. So what that meant is that ever since the beginning, every single Sonos device had to have exactly the same software. And this is the problem today. If they're saying that the older devices can't update their software, then the newer devices, which are going to get new features, no one knows what these new features are. Perhaps it's going to be lossless or high-resolution music. Perhaps, there's going to be new streaming opportunities. Who knows? But if the older ones don't have the same software as the newer ones, then they can't fully participate. Now, to me, as someone on the outside, but who understands this technology, I would have thought there's two solutions. The first is go back to using a bridge. Tell people, if you want to use older devices, we're going to sell you a bridge. It's going to cost you $20. The bridge will separate out your signals to the older devices for the things that they can handle, and to the newer devices, which may have more features. The other solution is build it into the app that you're using to control Sonos. But then the problem with that, with Sonos, you can have an app tell a speaker to start streaming, say, Apple Music or Spotify. And that speaker is no longer dependent on the app to do that streaming. It gets the data directly, then sends it around the network. So having an app do it means the app would have to be accessible all the time, and that's probably not a good idea. But you go back to a bridge, you put software in the bridge that separates out what the different devices can handle, because, most people are just using these for music. And see, this is the annoying thing. If you're using Alexa or Google Assistant, which you can do on some of the more recent devices, I can understand that it needs to have different software. It's got a microphone, it's got to process the audio. But if you're just sending music to multiple speakers, then this is really overkill to say that those speakers, say your old Play 1s, need to have the same software as a new speaker that has a microphone and voice assistance.
So my initial
I see
reaction
the wheels turning in your head there.
Well, yeah, because I'm a Sonos fan. I've been a Sonos fan. I will continue to be a Sonos fan. I think your comments about a PR nightmare are spot on. The communications department. Sorry, guys, you've blown this, and this is not the first time that Sonos has had some communication issues.
Well, hey, let's go back to November when they first announced that if you had older devices, you could trade them in and get a 30% discount on new devices. People should have seen this whole thing coming in November. They should have seen the January thing coming in November. But Sonos was saying, no, we're not planning to make your devices obsolete. We just want to give you a chance to upgrade to new hardware. And the PR disaster there was that when you do this, Sonos gives you 14 days, then they send a signal to your device, which essentially bricks it. So it cannot be used ever again. So essentially, they were giving existing users a discount to buy new stuff and telling them to throw their old stuff into a landfill rather than just saying, hey, here's a discount, do what you want with the old stuff, maybe give it to someone who can use it.
Yeah, and I kind of see the point because of the integration of the speakers. And even then, you would have the expectation of, okay, well, you haven't bricked it, but gee, it still should work, or still should be an option.
Well, and as you know, most Sonos speakers have no option other than to work through the Sonos ecosystem. The Play 5 does have a line-in jack, so you could, let's say, use an Airport Express or an Apple TV with AirPlay and plug it into the back, or you could plug any other source into it. I don't think any of the other devices do. The new amp has a line in, so you can plug in a turntable or CD player. But none of the older speakers have any source of input. So while you could easily recycle the Play 5 and use it without it being on the Sonos system, without it using the software, you can't do that with any of the others.
Right. And Kirk, I guess the conclusion I've kind of come to is this was something that none of us really thought about when we started getting smart devices. And now I'm going beyond Sonos. I'm talking about the Amazon devices, the Google devices, even Apple's HomePod. Because there are no inputs, like you were saying, if they decide to if any of those decide to discontinue servicing these devices, they're bricked. I mean, they're pieces of plastic and metal, and that's pretty much it.
Yeah,
And that's
so I think there's a couple things to consider. I'm in a Facebook group for Sonos users, and it was pretty much divided. I wouldn't say which percentage, but divided between how dare you and other people. Oh, well, Apple does it every year when they upgrade their iPhone. There's a huge difference. Apple upgrades an iPhone, and I think today you can use iOS 13 on an iPhone 6. There's an iPhone 6S, so 6S, 7, 7S, 8, X, XS. So that's 6 years back. And if you have a slightly older phone, you can still use iOS 12 for another couple of generations back. But the second difference is this integration of the Sonos devices into a system where every device has to have the same kind of hardware. I don't know of any other devices where it works like that. Now, I've got a couple Philips Hue light bulbs. Maybe it's something similar. I'm not really concerned about a $20 light bulb as I am, for a $500 speaker. But I can't think of anything else where a single device will break the chain. The HomePod's an interesting example. Yes, there's no aux in, but what Apple did when they so I don't know if you remember when AirTunes was launched. It might have been 2004. This was the ability of iTunes to stream music to devices over Wi-Fi. Initially, I think it was just the Airport Express. Then with the third generation Apple TV, if I'm not mistaken, you could do it there as well. They changed it to AirPlay after a while, and they recently introduced AirPlay 2. But they made AirPlay 2 backwards compatible with AirPlay 1. So as our guest in last week's podcast said, he's got some Apple devices from 2008 that he still streams music to. So again, the Sonos thing is a whole system, and that's its weakness. Pretty much every other company, they're going to insist on backwards compatibility. I've got very commonly used dongle these days, USB-A to USB-C, right? I can plug a USB-A plug into this and plug it into my MacBook, which has a USB-C connector, which is Thunderbolt 2 or whatever. But it could be a USB-A device from 20 years ago, and it's still going to work. Obviously, you can't really compare, but we're still talking about backwards compatibility that's respected, whereas Sonos, remember that figure, 92%? 92% of their devices are still in use, and they want to kick out how many? I'd like to know what percent, because Sonos has gotten more popular lately. Initially, Sonos was for audio geeks who wanted whole home audio. And when did you get your first Sonos?
I was thinking today, I had to look it up, 2008.
Okay, so 12 years ago. Back then, the landscape was different. You could have done AirPlay if you wanted, but there weren't that many devices that would do it. Would you really want to put AirPlay Expresses all over your house with stereo amplifiers and speakers? It's really complicated, and Sonos made sense. But back in the day, these were people who were looking at the entire home system. Today, Sonos is selling smart speakers like an Amazon Echo or a HomePod. I'm pretty sure the Play 1 has to be their most popular speaker. Wonderful speaker, by the way, better than the HomePod in audio quality, but it's not the same audience. I'm going to speculate that they're selling 100 times as many Sonos ones as they did Play ones back in the day. So the Play 1 is the older one that only works with the Sonos system. The Sonos one has AirPlay. I think it has Bluetooth as well. And so I've got a pair of them in my bedroom, and I stream with AirPlay. I never use the Sonos app except to set it up or to change the EQ. I've got a Sonos Beam on my TV, and I've got a Sonos amp here. But all of them, for me, I just use them with AirPlay. I don't even use the entire synchronize, because I don't want music in every room of the house, and my partner wouldn't like that anyway.
Zapier, the easiest way to automate your business tasks, is sponsoring this edition of MacVoices. When you're running your own business, your to-do list is never ending. You know you could automate many of the tasks you do, but you don't know how. That's where Zapier comes in. Zapier connects and moves information between your web apps so that you don't have to. Just pick your apps from the list of over 1,500 that Zapier works with. Yes, I said 1,500 apps, so it's almost a given that whatever you're using already is supported. Just a few clicks and Zapier will take information from Gmail and move it to your CRM, or to a spreadsheet, or wherever you want to go. And not just any information or all the information, but the information you decide that you want to capture. No code, no programming, just a few minutes of clicks and your first Zapier automation is on the job. The more I look at Zapier, the more things I find that I can automate to make my life easier. And who deserves an easier life than you? More than 4.5 million people are saving an average of 40 hours per month by using Zapier. I can sure use that 40 hours, and I bet you can too. So go to our special link at zapier.com/MacVoices through the end of the month to get a 14-day free trial. That's zapier.com/MacVoices, zapier.com/MacVoices for 14 days of simple, powerful business automation. Zapier.com/MacVoices. Thanks to Zapier for their support of MacVoices. First of all, okay, so I want to go back to the iPhone for a second, because the iPhone, even though you may not be able to run the current OS or even the previous OS 12, if you have an old iPhone and it still functions, physically, you can use it as you can use it for apps as such as they were when you were able to load them on. Those devices have not been bricked. The bricking thing bothers me a bit, because it's like, okay, give me the discount and then let me help you expand your ecosystem by handing these over to somebody that could use them, or let me put them in a basement or a bedroom or something where I didn't have them before, and that's great. The landfill thing, of course, the eco people went crazy over that,
and rightly so, because this is a strategy. It's normal for companies to say, hey, we're going to give you a discount to upgrade your stuff. But to then say it's useless, that's wrong. So I have a pair of KEF speakers over here, which face my comfy chair that you can't see, I don't think. I bought them last year. There was a promotion for KEF speakers, 20% if you upgrade an old pair of speakers. So I called up a store that's a chain of stores in the UK that does audio equipment. I said, hey, I want to buy these speakers and I've got these old ones. What do I do? Do I ship them back to you? I said, no, you keep them. Don't worry. It's just, you get the 20% discount. And that to me is what Sonos should have done. It's not like what they would have lost selling speakers at 30% off. They would have gained in goodwill. And it's important to notice also that there is no competition on Sonos prices, kind of like Apple. Current devices are never discounted. No, it's not true. You'll get discounts at Christmas and all that, but you'll always find the same price at different dealers. Sonos doesn't let dealers sell lower than their current price. So it's not like, their margin must be like Apple's margin. So them selling some devices at 30% off, plus they'd be selling them directly, so they wouldn't be giving a retailer a cut. For them, that's a win-win.
Oh, absolutely. And I don't for a second believe that they're selling these upgrades at a loss, nor should they. They're just not making their normal profit margin. And that's okay, but the idea of taking my old speaker from me, and listen, if they had done that and just let those speakers go and say, okay, at some point they're not going to be supported anymore, I don't think that would have been the firefight. But the idea
or if they said, okay, we'll recycle them, that would have been worth doing. Instead, they're saying dump them in a landfill, which is really not responsible these days.
Yeah.
Again, that 92% figure, that just there's an itch in there trying to figure out what the curve looks like. How many of these devices are old? Let's say you've got 12-year-old Sonos equipment and you're thinking, well, they'll give me 30% off, so maybe I'll upgrade some of it. But if you think about it, it's not going to be that different. Your stuff is good. Sonos is good quality. It's got good audio. The Sonos One might be a little bit better than the Play One, but by how much? Not enough to really want to upgrade it. Think about back in the day when we had a stereo, an amplifier, and speakers, and maybe a turntable. You would never buy one of these things thinking that, well, in 10 years' time, it's not going to work anymore. I mean, quite the contrary. Vintage audio gear is a big deal. In fact, our next track episode, I think our next episode is going to be one we recorded about vintage audio gear, looking back at some of these really Baroque receivers from the 1970s with buttons and dials and toggle switches and all that, and how attractive they are. And this is stuff that's, 40 years old, 30 years old, and still works fine. So this raises the broader question of how much of our stuff that isn't computers is going to be like computers in 5 or 10 years' time. You mentioned the HomePod. I mentioned my Philips Hue lights. I've got a Dyson fan over there. When I first got this fan, I had to download a firmware upgrade to be able to use the fan. And it's because it's got an app and you can control it, and that makes sense. But I don't think you can turn it on. There's no switch to turn it on. You have to use either the app or remote control. So at some point, if this is no longer supported, it won't be a fan anymore. It'll just be a piece of plastic.
Okay, so I want to flip this around though, and maybe defend Sonos a little bit, because we're constantly expecting new things, asking for new features. And so is it reasonable? Because you and I would not expect an iPhone 6 to do everything that an iPhone 11 does. Okay,
no, but I would not think of new features for a speaker. It plays music, and it's pretty much you have one job and that's it. So let's get into some technical aspects here. The memory in these older devices is quite small. You may have heard this before, but there's a limit of about 65,000 tracks for a library that Sonos can read. So I did this the other day because I don't use it because my library is bigger than that. And it reads, so you point it to a music folder. In my case, this was the folder on my iMac is for the music app. It reads the folders in alphabetical order by artist, and it got up to Pink Floyd. So I could listen to some Pink Floyd albums on my Sonos devices through the Sonos app, but I couldn't listen to the Rolling Stones. I couldn't listen to Santana. I couldn't listen to Tangerine Dream. This is inexcusable, but again, this is part of the fact that every Sonos device has to have everything, and there's not enough memory on these devices, these older devices, to allow this. So one of the features I can imagine is that Sonos allows more room for larger libraries. People have been complaining about this for 10 years. Another feature that some users have been saying is, well, maybe high-resolution audio. And this could make sense, except Sonos gear is not high-resolution audio quality. It's normal resolution audio quality. You can already play lossless audio through it. So if you have Apple Lossless or FLAC, depending on which app you're using, you can play that. But high resolution needs audio equipment of higher quality. Other than that, I can't think of any features I want in a speaker. It plays music.
Well, but high resolution audio was not a thing back then. The multi-room audio was a thing that Sonos really was the one that kind of championed.
They made it mainstream. They really did. I mean, there were other companies like Squeezebox that didn't last very long, but Sonos, because it was easy to use, they mainstreamed it.
Absolutely. And I don't mind saying, one of the reasons I went with Sonos is I got tired of trying to string cables and all for a home theater system. And my home theater system is basically 2 play 5s, the center channel sound bar, and 2 play 1s in the back, and a sub. And that's a very nice system. Is it 7.1 or 9.1? No, but I don't spend that much time watching it. It's more than good enough and really provides a wonderful experience. So there's so many things that Sonos did, and there's so many things that we've come to demand from things. And I've kind of rethought this a little bit. I'm not angry with Sonos. A little disappointed maybe, but not really angry like some people seem to be, because I kind of get it, but I never really. But the problem is I didn't think about it before.
Right.
That, this is my first time thinking about a speaker or a piece of audio equipment becoming quote unquote obsolete.
Well, I'm not particularly angry with them. In fact, the only reason I did buy some Sonos devices recently was because they do support AirPlay 2. And I had no desire to use the Sonos app because it can't read my whole music library, among other reasons. Someone from Sonos contacted me, I believe it was in 2014, sent me a whole big carton of Sonos gear, said, I want you to become familiar with it because, I was writing about audio and music and all that. And it was very interesting. But the limitation of having to use the app back then meant that I just couldn't use it. So when AirPlay 2 came out, I started exploring it. I bought a first Sonos One, then a Beam, then the amp, and then a second Sonos One. All of these are AirPlay 2 compatible, and I would assume that any changes to Sonos software isn't going to affect that. That's something that's flashed somewhere on a chip someplace. It's firmware that has to be compatible with Apple because AirPlay is an Apple protocol, and it works, and that's it. So I'm not angry. I'm not particularly concerned about my devices not lasting very long. However, I'm thinking in a few years I'll sell my Sonos amp and get something else. I'm thinking that the way forward for this sort of thing is to find a self-powered speaker or self-powered pair of speakers and connect it to some sort of device like an Apple TV or an old Airport Express. I'm thinking I'm not going to depend for something that expensive on the whims of one company, which could disappear one day. Let's imagine they're suing Google for intellectual property things. They're saying they worked with Google, and Google stole some of their ideas to release their own speakers. Well, what if they lose this lawsuit and go bankrupt and no one's supporting the Sonos system anymore? What if Google buys them out and kills them all? These things are certainly possible. I'd say unlikely, but they're certainly possible. So what do we do when that happens? I'm not sure I want to trust for the long term a system like that where you don't know where it's going to go. Again, I've only got a few devices. I'm pretty sure the Sonos Beam can work as is because it's over HDMI, so it's not even streaming from the TV. The amp is a bit more complicated because there's no real buttons on it. So everything you do through the app. But I wouldn't commit to a whole home system today with Sonos. I'd be very wary about what's going to happen. You set up a whole home system, you want it to last, I don't know, 20 years. That's the minimum for something. This is not devices that are under stress. They don't heat up a lot. There's no wear to them. So the fact that they're being obsoleted so quickly, it's just not right. I mean, we have so much crap in technology that doesn't work. Do we really need more that's not going to work because the company that makes it decides to prevent it from working?
Let me challenge that for a second, and I'm really not sure. But let's say that I have my Sonos system. I'm using a local library that is less than 65,000 tracks, and I have it running on a computer that's not connected to the internet. I have a Wi-Fi in my house, but I don't have that Wi-Fi connected to the internet. Does the Sonos stop working?
No, you don't have to update your devices. In fact, what they first said is that if you don't update the older devices, then they'll still work with the newer devices as long as you don't update the newer devices. So you will, at some point, I don't know that they ask now for updates to devices, but presumably they will in the future. So you can freeze your system at a point. And one of the problems is that people are seeing that, well, Sonos is kind of recommending I freeze my system. But what are they going to do when there's a security issue? And, someone has a speaker with a microphone in it, and they need to issue security updates for some of these devices to ensure security of any sort of Internet of Things devices. If they're not going to issue security updates, then that's not a good thing to do. Again, for the newer ones with microphones. For the older ones, this is less of an issue, but still. So I want to know that bug fixes are going to be available. I don't want to have to worry about not being able to use. I don't want to worry about something breaking for a stupid reason because they can't issue an update.
No, I agree with that completely. I'm sitting here thinking, if I decide to freeze my system, what are the chances that something is going to break? And what are the chances that I'm going to, I guess, yeah.
I'd say the chances are slim, but what worries me more is the security implications of any smart home devices. These things are getting broken into all the time, whether they're, cameras or speakers or all that. Now, they haven't gotten the Philips Hue light bulb as far as I know, No, theoretically, you could create a botnet from these devices. A botnet is zombified computers that are used to send spam or to participate in what's called a distributed denial of service attack, where you get a million devices to hit a website or a service at one time. And this is, it's common in computer security to have to worry about that. I'd say for Sonos, for the older devices, I'm less worried. The newer devices with speakers, I would be worried. And so going forward, are they saying that we're going to be safe for 10 years or 20 years? They can't commit to that because that would be like almost legally binding to say that. Interestingly, consumer law in the UK is such that they have to provide support for up to 6 years. So some of these devices were sold as late as last year. And apparently some are still for sale that have been in the channel for a while, and retailers still have some. So I would be within my rights to go back to the retailer and say, you need to refund me for this because it's less than 6 years and they're telling me it's not going to work anymore.
Yeah, that's an interesting point. Of course, I have the U.S. perspective, you have the European perspective, but
Yeah.
at the same time, it's all there. I don't know. I
have a
I've changed-
Brexit perspective. It's a little bit different. It's not European anymore. I have a lonely, isolated island perspective.
Oh, that doesn't sound good at all. No. I guess again, I've changed my thinking a little bit, and I'm going to withdraw what I said earlier because I would definitely need to have the Sonos application running on my Mac, and that at the very least is probably going to have to be updated. I mean, look what happened with iTunes and now music. Now we have a whole different way of interacting with music from the Apple perspective. That's not necessarily true from the Sonos
it's going to have to be updated for operating system updates at a minimum. Right. So there's always going to be updates for that every year. There may not be huge update, change from iTunes to Music app. That was a big change. These updates may be small, but they will be necessary. Again, how hard would it be for them to make a bridge? I mean, they've already done this, that can actually control the different devices. It has the circuitry and the software necessary to separate out what device can do what. I mean, it makes their system look less complicated than it is now, but it just moves them back to their approach in the past. And what percentage of people need it? Again, 92% of devices, but what percent of people? Assuming that their growth is on a nice curve, because they have become very popular lately, I'm thinking that the majority of people with the older devices is a minority of overall users. I'm thinking that today most people have one or two Sonos devices, whereas when you bought them, most people bought a dozen or half a dozen devices because they were thinking big picture.
Right. And it was a different time, believe it or not. It wasn't that long ago, but people approached listening to music differently. I think now it's a lot more. We didn't
stream music.
Yeah, we didn't stream it. It was a lot more maybe dedicated at times, and now it's much more casual. So, yeah, and to be fair, if you do stop and think about this sort of ties in, and I don't know if this will light you up or not, but it sort of ties into the subscription model of software for some software developers.
Sonos that's another big issue. Yeah.
Yeah, and Sonos is not making any money off of the speakers that they sold me X number of years ago.
Why should they?
I mean, well,
Land's End isn't making any money of this flannel shirt I bought a year ago.
But that shirt doesn't. Yeah, but that shirt doesn't require any updates.
Yes, it does. I have to wash it.
No, but that's you kind of
but you got a good point. You're saying that you've got to pay for the support of what you bought, right. But we have to assume that their business model plans for that. That when they sold you 10 speakers 12 years ago, that they weren't planning on you buying any more. That what you paid back then covered the future in terms of that. And as going forward, you maybe buy another device and another one to build up your system. This is all part of the same thing.
I would agree with that, except that just like you and I didn't see it coming, I'm not sure they saw everything coming. They didn't see streaming, and they've
been planning for this for years. I mean, streaming in Sonos is what, 3, 4, 5 years old? Spotify originally and others. It's not new. They've been planning for this for quite some time. They've just been trying to figure out how to do it. And I think they finally realized that they had no choice and they had to do something. Um, what this does is it raises the question of, as I said earlier, an integrated system, its interdependence on each other device, and the need for each device to be up to date. And again, I don't know any other system that works like this. There may be some. Um, my Philips Hue light bulbs, I don't think they all have to have the same software to work together. And again, I wouldn't know, because if one stops working, it's not $500, it's $20. So I'm not that worried. But the fact that you've got a system that kind of meshes is really what is the weakness here, in my opinion.
Yes, it's a characteristic. It's a strength and a weakness, both.
Well,
Okay,
it's a strength because it allows them to do what they do, but it's a weakness because it locks them into a model. Because look, today with AirPlay 2, you can do the same thing, and you don't have this interdependence. AirPlay 2 will stream to any device that can use AirPlay 2, and you can get the syncing and the higher buffering with AirPlay 2 devices. With AirPlay 1s, they might not be perfectly in sync, but you can still stream to them. They're not dependent on each other. It's a hub and spoke topology instead of a mesh topology. And while the mesh made sense back in the days of slow Wi-Fi, it probably doesn't anymore.
Boy, somewhere I'm hearing rings of 5G discussions from CES in my ears, that how 5G
Yes.
is 5G is changing, that is going to change things, depending on where you are and what you do and how much, those are all debatable, but it's going to change it, just like 4G changes, just like, having the internet in your pocket with an iPhone has changed things. And this is where I'm trying to examine my own feelings, and I've gotten away from my gut reaction. It's like, okay, maybe I should have been charging, or maybe Sonos could say, you know what, if you want your old speakers to work, we will sell you a service contract of a software service contract.
Do you remember when Apple charged money for an iOS update? I think it was just for the iPod Touch that you paid $10 or $20. This is early days of iOS. Do you remember when they charged money for some feature on the Mac? And everyone was saying, oh, they have some accounting rule that Foxhole, Anthony, whatever accounting law was something, which they've never done since. And there was some weird reason, and it was very poorly received, and it's not surprising. I shouldn't have to pay to get my speakers to work after I'm not renting them. I've purchased them. It's a different thing.
Yeah, but it's a different world too. I mean, we could have this. We could have the same. We could have the same discussion over software.
We can.
Is it right for Adobe to say I have to subscribe to their cloud service because they decided not to support Photoshop?
Did you see how much they made last year? Record earnings. So initially, a lot of photographers said, "I'll never subscribe to Adobe," and yet they said, "Remember how much it used to cost for Microsoft Office to buy a license?" So much that I never bought Office. I only bought Word and maybe Excel back in the day. When I worked as a translator, I sometimes needed to use Excel. Now I pay about £50 a year for an Office 365 subscription. So I'm not going to complain about a subscription when it's that much cheap. Do you remember how much Photoshop cost back in the day?
Oh, yeah, a lot.
And you're paying $10 a month or $20 a month. So you're not paying anywhere near what you would have paid in the past. So that sort of subscription to me isn't a problem. The issue of subscription comes up with other apps. I won't mention the name, but one app just got updated last week for iOS and Mac, and there's been a lot of talk. Well, it's a subscription. Why should it be a subscription? Because they need to pay going forward. And I think the real problem is that Apple doesn't allow upgrade pricing. So you can't say to someone, hey, you can buy this new version, you can buy version 12, or you can keep version 11, but you won't get the new features in version 12. So the only way to do it is to upgrade version 11 to a subscription model to number 12. And I think it's a problem with the model itself. I think the business model of software is broken, but I don't see this relating to hardware. And that's the whole point, is that hardware is hard, and it's something that lasts, and it's something that should last. And
Uh, I know where you're going. I'm just not sure I agree with it. I want to go back to what you were saying about system software. Hey, I remember paying for, multiple versions of Apple system software. And under today's model, we would laugh at that and say, what are you talking about? Why would I do that? Well, it had new features, it had bug fixes, and they had to pay for it somehow. And now it's and Apple's well, I definitely know that Apple kind of led the way for free system software.
Yeah, they were the
That
first.
yeah,
And other than Linux, obviously.
well, yeah,
But I remember, I think the last, I don't remember which version of OS 10, was it Jaguar or Panther that you paid $129 for? Or there was an upgrade pricing of maybe $79 if you had the previous model. And then, of course, it depended on whether you bought a computer in the last 12 months, and then you might get I remember having to pay 20 euros once for an upgrade because I had bought a computer after the new OS had come out, but it was still an older computer in the channel that didn't have the new OS, and I felt that was really cheap. But at the time, 20 euros wasn't a big deal. But yeah, I mean, so we're paying a lot less for certain things than we are. But nevertheless, when we talk about hardware, it's different. Do you think you should buy a microwave today and know that in 10 years you can't use it, or you have to pay for an upgrade to be able to use it again?
I don't know. I mean,
There are limitations. Like, okay, you've got a scanner over there, and that looks like one of those scan snaps. And obviously, it's now obsoleted because it doesn't work. The software doesn't work with Catalina. But how long have you had
right.
it? I bought one of those in 2012. No one required me to pay to be able to keep using it. However, I would have paid for an upgrade for them to make it 64-bit compatible, so it would still work. In fact, I haven't needed mine for a while, but I'm going to use a Windows virtual machine in Fusion, and I'll install their Windows software there when I do need it.
I'm glad you brought that up because that's a great example of a piece of hardware that has been obsoleted by the new operating system for the Mac. And
yes,
so,
but the fact that you can't update that does not mean you can't use your printer or camera or monitor.
no, but
And with
I can't use that scanner. That's
Yes, but with Sonos, you can't use your speaker with the new ones if you want to keep using the old one. This is the real problem. That the old ones affect the new ones. Again, that whole mesh system, as opposed to hub and spoke isolated. You can't just keep using the old ones that you don't want to update if you want to update the new ones.
I feel like we're in a transition period for business
We
models.
certainly are.
For a lot of this stuff.
And I think this is a bad step for a technology. But again, I don't know any other technology. My dishwasher does not depend on my refrigerator. They don't need to have the same software versions. So I don't know any other technology where this is really an issue. You'll get it in software that certain app can only work on a certain version of software, but you don't get that with hardware.
Yes.
Go ahead, find one.
Okay, well, FireWire. Now you can use adapters, but FireWire's. Well, let's go farther back. Let's do SCSI.
Yeah,
let's do SCSI. Let's do iOmega zip disks and jazz.
Let's do serial ports.
Yeah.
But that doesn't prevent. So, okay, your computer's updated. That doesn't prevent you from using an adapter of some sort. As I said earlier, look, USB-A to USB-C. I can use 20-year-old devices and plug them into my MacBook Pro because I have an adapter. It's not the same. And your zip drive not being updated doesn't prevent your computer from working.
No, but it prevents me from using the zip drive and getting the data off of it. And maybe, folks, if you can do it, great. Maybe there's somebody that can connect a zip drive to a USB-C port. I don't know, but it certainly is not something that is going to be easy necessarily to do. So
this is interesting because I've been working with computers. I bought my first Mac in 1991, so we're getting on 30 years. And I've gone through the transition from floppy disks to zip drives to USB devices, et cetera. Each time the transition, for me, a hard drive has a life of 3 years. In fact, I don't use a hard drive more than 3 years old. I replace them because hard drives are always going to die, and I'd rather not have them die. I'd rather spend another couple $100 to replace each drive. So I'm not particularly concerned that, between the time I buy hard drive A and the time that it's going to be replaced, that there's some change. It's not going to be overnight that this change is going to happen in terms of, because remember when we had FireWire and USB together. So I had an iMac SE DV. Do you remember that one? The gray one had a DVD drive in it, and it had a FireWire port and it had USB ports. So I had been using FireWire previously, and then I was able to use USB. So you have this transition. And I think data storage is a really good example, because data storage devices are, I wouldn't say temporary, but they're not long-term for the two reasons is, one, the mechanics of the device can go bad, and two, the support, the media that you're using can go bad because it's magnetic. So I don't see that as, it's not the same. It's not the same. You shouldn't be using a 10-year-old hard drive, period. It's not a good idea.
Yeah, amen to that.
Well, for anything important, if you're using it temporary, like I put some security cameras outside my house recently, and I've got a USB drive connected to the device's hub, and it's writing stuff, and it's temporary. If it dies, it'll die. Doesn't matter how old the drive is, because when it dies, it gets replaced. But you wouldn't want to trust it for data that you need to back up and you need to store.
No, agreed. I don't know. I mean, I think we may have a bit of a fundamental disagreement here. I am rethinking this, and I'm not sure that won't come over to your side, but I'm just feeling like I'm seeing it a little bit differently, and I wasn't even thinking about it. I opened my Sonos app on my Mac, and your system needs to be updated. Okay, update it. And I'm not really thinking about somewhere somebody had to write that update and do it. It's just like, okay, I have to wait 30 seconds to maybe a minute and a half before I get to listen to my music. And now I'm starting to think about, okay, this stuff is sophisticated. I do want it to work with the new operating systems, and I wanted it to work with Apple Music, and I wanted it to work with Spotify, and all these things that it didn't do when it first came out. And so these are features that had to be added. What's going to happen next week when we get another, I have no idea what it's going to be, but another service or another way to listen to music, and Sonos is going to have to pay
okay,
for
so
the
the
update.
streaming services aren't a big issue. There's probably not a lot of code that needs to go into the Sonos apps and the Sonos hardware for the streaming services. To be fair to Sonos, they support like 50 different services, half of which I've never heard of. But that's not a lot of code. That's an API that's connecting to a remote server to manage everything. So that's not really complicated in terms, there's no processing going on there, very little. The bigger features are, as I said, library size, potentially high resolution music. Maybe they're going to come out with a TV, so every speaker needs to also be able to handle video. I don't know, I'm speculating. But maybe they're going to go into true surround sound audio, because currently it's kind of a kludge to set up a system like you have there, to get the surround sound with your Sonos devices. Who knows? But I think the two elements here are important. One is, this is kind of a wake-up call that there are certain types of hardware that we just consider to have a long life that doesn't, because it depends on software. And two, any system where each device depends on another means that the system can't function unless all the devices are up to par, and that to me is a big red flag for the future.
And I would ask people to take away the fact that this is something, whether you like it or not, and you can buy a speaker that you don't need to maintain. Fine, that's fine. This particular system does need to be maintained, and so maybe you need to pay for it, and maybe you want to be cautious about, as Kirk said, about the future. But and for heaven's sake, Sonos, please get your communication policy together, because it's painful to see a really good company like this with a really great product, make so many missteps and invoke such ire. And I just felt, I really did feel bad for them.
It's really not clear what they're going to do. We won't know until May. They said one thing, then they kind of changed a little bit what they said. But even Sonos users are like, well, I'm not exactly sure what that means. That you'll be able to segregate your two sets of devices, and it's not really clear. Going forward, I would say to anyone that devices that support AirPlay are extremely common now. If you use a Mac, if you use iOS, you can stream to multiple devices from any of those from your Mac, from your iOS device. Far better to get an AirPlay device where you're not dependent on one vendor and one vendor's software being updated. You can get multiple different AirPlay speakers. Far better to do that than to depend on a single service, because what the Sonos ecosystem did previously is now available with a couple of taps on an iPhone.
Yeah, good point. Good point. I hope we've given folks some things to think about.
I'm sure that, I've heard from a lot of people who are really angry about when I explain some of this stuff, and they're really angry, but Sonos said it's going to be okay. And I think that's a bit of a shame. And I think other people are just so fed up because they did commit to a lot of money. And damn, there's more important things to worry about. But we shouldn't have
Yeah.
to. People have spent thousands of dollars. You spent a couple $1,000s. I spent about the same on my devices. We shouldn't have to worry about this sort of stuff.
No, and you're right. You're right. You're right. But you just said it. We're still waiting. One thing I do want to give Sonos credit for, as far as I know, because I just checked this morning, and as of this morning, as we record this, Sonos, the option is still out there to do your upgrade, and I haven't seen an expiration on that. So at least in
I think
theory,
it's going to be available going forward, because a lot of people. So anyone with an old device got an email saying these are because they know which devices you're using, and you
Sure.
got an email saying these are the devices that are going to be obsolete, and that the change is going to happen in May. So I'm assuming that they're going to give people at least till the end of the year, because not everyone's going to jump right away.
Well, yeah, and it would have been real easy to say, "Hey, for a limited time, you can get 30% off." And to their credit, they have not done that. And so, in theory, and folks, if you are one of those affected, you want to watch it. But in theory, you could wait until May or until your speakers die for whatever reason, and then do the upgrade and still get the 30%. Now, that big caveat there, you want to make sure they will continue to do that. But I would like to think that Sonos now, after this, I call it a debacle, would give. They'd be waving the banner long and loud about when they were going to stop the upgrade pricing. So
yeah, I think
there
so.
you go. Kirk, this has been fun. I'm not sure we agree on some of it.
No, I'm kidding.
Yeah, but I hope we give some people some things to think about, that maybe they don't have the knee-jerk reactions, and at least they think through it and then decide for themselves.
Yeah, I'm getting more and more frustrated these days with this sort of problem in technology, that we can't just use something anymore without there being issues and updates and troubleshooting and fixes and patches. And it's just.
It's the world we live in. It's the world we live in.
Yeah, it's not necessarily a good thing, though.
No. You're just
because
grouchy
a lot of stuff breaks.
You're just grouchy because of Brexit.
No, I'm grouchy because of technology in general. I'm getting more and more frustrated with the number of things that don't work. There's just all over the place. Things don't work. Technology doesn't work, and when it's interesting, young people who are growing up today who never knew a world pre-internet don't know what it's like to not necessarily have to worry about things not working the same way. Maybe your phone would go out and the phone company would fix it. But you get an internet outage and how much trouble it is to get it fixed. You can't get mobile, you can't get cellular coverage, and that's a hassle. And there's things all over the place. There's far too many problems. I just totally different subject. I'm sure you've covered it recently. The problems with macOS Catalina and iOS 13, more Catalina than iOS. Apple needs to say, hey, we're taking a year off. That's it. We're not going to update anything. We're going to issue maintenance updates, but we're not going to come out with a new operating system this year. It's really time. This annual cycle is just fatiguing, not only for us who report on it, but even for average users who have to learn new things every year. These are incremental changes. They're not big, but they're big enough that people are just getting tired of updating.
No, I think there's a lot of wisdom to that. You're right. For the geeks, it's great because you have new things to play with. But for the average user who just wants to get their work done, I'm not sure that all those changes make that big a difference. Before we go, I want to make sure, because you've created a crazy number of podcasts. And I want to ask you to go through each one of them and make sure folks know where they can find you when you're not here talking about this and arguing with me.
Okay, you'll put links in the show notes. So the next track is my music podcast that I co-host with Doug Adams. We talk about how people listen to music today. We talk about technology and we talk about music. Photoactive, which I co-host with Jeff Carlson, is of photography, is a podcast about photography. We talk about photography with a lot of attention to the Apple ecosystem because we're both Apple guys. I co-host the Intego Mac podcast, which is about computer security. Intego is a vendor of Mac security software for more than 20 years. The Committed with Ian Trey and Rob Griffiths. That is a Mac-centric podcast, or Mac and Apple-centric podcast. And The Zen of Everything with my Zen teacher, Jundo Cohen, who lives in Japan, where we just give a Zen take on everyday life.
Is that all?
That's all. Actually, someone suggested I start another podcast. It's like, no.
Yeah.
Podcasts, and most of them are every 2 weeks, except for the Intego podcast. In fact, most of them, the next track and Photoactive were weekly, and I just got too tired of doing that many podcasts a week. So there are fortnightly podcasts, and I think that it's a lot better for all the hosts involved. It's a lot better for listeners. You don't need something new every week, and not everyone listens to the latest episode every week. So, but no, I don't think I'll be doing any more podcasts unless someone wants to pay me to do a podcast. In that case, I'm available.
Perfect. Kirk, thanks so much. It was a lot of fun. We'll do it again.
Thanks, Chuck.
Folks, I'm Chuck Joyner. This is MacVoices. I hope we've given you, again, some things to think about. Maybe look at it from a little different angle. Doesn't mean I'm right. Doesn't mean Kirk's right. You figure out what's right for you. Until the next time, and as always, thanks for watching. Visit MacVoices.com for show notes and to connect with Chuck on social media. Get involved in our Facebook group or like our Facebook page, and get more out of your Apple tech with MacVoices Magazine, free on Flipboard and on the web. And if you find value in it all, consider supporting us through either our Patreon campaign at patreon.com/MacVoices or by making a one-time donation via the PayPal link on our front page and in the show notes of each episode. You will join these fine people who help bring you Mac Voices. Advertising handled by Backbeat Media at backbeatmedia.com. Bandwidth provided by CashFly at cashfly.com.